This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Time for discussion. Grab the mic. It's my honor to introduce this truly fantastic panel to discuss voting rights, queer rights, human rights, new opportunities for scholarship in the archives. Courtney Chartier is the head of research services at the Manuscript, Archives, and Rare Book Library, Marble, at Emory University. She was previously the assistant head of the Archives Research Center at the Atlanta University Center. And when she was there, she processed the papers of the voter education project, Martin Luther King and Tupac Shakur. She is also the president of the Society of Georgia Archivists, regent for outreach for the Academy of Certified Archivists, and former co-chair of the Archivists and Archives of Color Roundtable of the Society of American Archivists. We also have, and following Courtney, we have Sarah Quigley. Sarah is a manuscript archivist at Emory University's Marble. She has a BA in history and MS in information studies, both from the University of Texas at Austin. From 2007 to 2009, she was a project archivist at the Jesse Helms Center, focusing on the arrangement of the former senator's congressional records. In 2009, she joined the staff at Marble as a project archivist working with the records of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. She recently co-curated an exhibition called And the Struggle Continues, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference's Fight for Social Change, based on the collection. Since 2011, she has been part of the permanent Marble staff working with a variety of collections documenting Southern history, African American culture and history, and British and Irish literature. She is currently vice president of the Society of Georgia Archivists, as well as vice chair of the Society of American Archivists Issues and Advocacy Roundtable. She frequently presents about her work with the SCLC records, as well as issues relating to archival advocacy and outreach. Following Sarah will be Randy Gu. Randy is a curator of modern political and historical collections at Emory University's Marble. He arrived at Emory in 1989 as an undergraduate, and he stuck around long enough to collect 3 degrees from the venerable Decatur institution. Randy found his calling in life when he started working in Marble as a graduate student in 1998. And since then, he has spent his time preaching the gospel of Marble's distinctive collections about Atlanta and Southern history, politics, and culture. Randy was awarded the 2013 Association of College and Research Libraries Women and Gender Studies Section Award for significant achievement in women's and gender studies librarianship. He is also the host of Atlanta Intersections, a new series that brings together creative, dynamic Atlantans to talk about the city's past, present, and future. So without further ado, we'll begin with Courtney.
Thank you. I'm gonna try this on the stand and see how it goes. So I just wanted to say a few words about why the 3 of us put this panel together. And it's not only because we're all archivists and we love to show off the collections that we care about, but it's also because all 3 of us felt like these organizational records that we're going to talk about and these personal papers, in the case of what Randy's going to discuss, are places where there hasn't been a lot of scholarship. So I'm going to talk about the Voter Education Project, which is an organization that was founded in the kind of classic pre-68 civil rights era, but it was really after 68 that they spread their wings, became a really diverse and vibrant organization, and that history really hasn't been told. They did a lot of very important work, and it's kind of been eclipsed in the record. Same with what Sarah's going to talk about, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, very famous for Dr. King, Ralph Abernathy, all the work they did, but then in the 70s and 80s was still doing a lot of great work, and it hasn't been recognized yet in the scholarship. And same with the LGBT histories that Randy's going to talk about. These are things that we're ready for the scholars to come in and start using now that these collections are available to the public. So I am going to do a combination here, I think, of the formal paper I wrote and just kind of going through my slides and talking a little bit about VEP and the work that they were doing that I feel could be a really interesting piece for scholars. So the Voter Education Project was an Atlanta-based voting rights organization active from 62 to 92. VEP funded voter education and registration activities across the South, designed voter awareness campaigns, and compiled and published voter and election statistics on local, county, and state levels. While VEP was founded specifically to assist African Americans, the organization's programs expanded over time to include anyone discriminated against explicitly by voting laws or fraud, and implicitly through underrepresentation in elected positions or in voter rolls. This included Hispanic Americans, women, youth, the elderly, the poor, and the handicapped. This growth can be traced directly to the concept of Dr. King's beloved community, as it was under the leadership of Director John Lewis that VEP expanded their mission and vision. So from 2008 to 2009, I worked as the project archivist for the records of VEP, which are held at the Archives Research Center of the Atlanta University Center Robert W. Woodruff Library. This work was funded by a grant from the Council of Library and Information Resources as a part of their Hidden Collections grant program. And this specific grant was actually a collaboration between AUC, where I was, Emory to process the records of SCLC, Auburn Avenue to process the papers of Andrew Young, and the Amistad Research Center in New Orleans to process the papers of several different civil rights figures and organizations that were smaller collections that are at Amistad now. Science. So, sorry. Still get excited when technology works. So VEP was founded as a program of the Southern Regional Council in 1962. Robert F. Kennedy actually came up with the idea. He wanted to find a way to fund voter registration and education campaigns in southern states. And he actually saw it as a way that, well, if we get all these programs funded and people register to vote, there won't need to be protests anymore. And of course, that didn't quite work out. But in 1962, VEP became an official pilot program of SRC, and it was only intended to last a few years. The organization's activities were confined to giving grants to organizations conducting education and registration campaigns and collecting data on voting. So what they would do is small organizations in southern states would apply to VEP for a grant, explain, we're going to run a citizenship education campaign in Jackson, Mississippi to teach people what it means to have the vote, what the responsibilities are. VEP would evaluate those applications and then give them funding. Some of the earliest organizations funded were SCLC in Atlanta, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Campaign in Sunflower County, Mississippi, and the collection actually has a beautiful handwritten application from Fannie Lou Hamer. And also SNCC in Selma, which led directly to the marches in '65, their voter education campaign. So in 1964, so because I'm an archivist, my presentation is mainly just images from the collection. And so one of the things that's great about these papers is all those grants that VEP gave out for 30 years have a file on each organization and what they did, and it includes their original application, how much money they got, but it also includes a lot of material that the organization would send back. So some of it was, sending back things like this flyer from Birmingham, saying, oh, well, part of the money went to print these flyers to encourage people to vote. But some of the interesting things that I'm going to show you later and talk about in a little more detail was they would also send back grant reports. And one of the things they would report on would be, the success of whatever campaign they were running, but also the challenges they faced. So some of these reports include Klan violence, they include reports of voter fraud, how people were being defrauded, how people were being stopped at the polls. And the reason I feel like this is so important for scholarship discussions is that many of this material is from like the late 70s and early 80s. It's not from 1965 in Selma where you're expecting to see this resistance. It's from a much later period after the South had desegregated, but not really. And so you're going to see a few of those on the slides today. So in '64, the SRC proposed that VEP become a permanent program, and they expanded their goals to include maximum voter registration, citizenship education courses, and leadership training for elected officials. Toward this effort, they established field offices in several southern states. And one of the programs I want to talk about with a little more specificity is their programs for newly elected officials. What these would be seminars for people who had just won an election, were voted in the office, but didn't actually know what it meant to now be an elected official. And so they would have these on a state-by-state basis, and the goal of them was to bring new officials in and talk about such topics as duties and responsibilities of their offices, how to serve people, politics, economics, and deal with the press, and to discuss common problems. And one of my favorite reports from these I found from Mississippi in '67. A group of all these new elected officials got together, and they realized that even though they had been allowed to run for office, all black candidates, even though they had been allowed to run for office and won, none of them could get bonded in their home counties, so technically they were ineligible for office. So this was just another way that counties that had been forced to allow black men and women to run for office were stopping them from taking office. And what happened, because all these men came together in Jackson for the seminar and said, oh, you can't get bonded, neither can I. VEP staff telegrammed the Attorney General's office, and within a week they all had their bonds so that they could take office. So this is a really important service that VEP offered was that they had the organization and the contacts to say, oh, well, the next step here is we call the Department of Justice and we file a complaint and we make sure this gets taken care of. So I think that's a really exciting and important function. So it's really in 1970 that VEP starts to expand philosophically, and that in most part is due to John Lewis coming on as their director. And that's him on the left, and if y'all saw Julian Bond last night, that's him on the right. I know, totally different. And I guess I probably shouldn't read John Lewis's pedigree, but I'm sure you all know that he started out at desegregating lunch counters at a student at Fisk and is now my congressman and has done about 85 jobs in between. And he's a wonderful man. He was a natural fit for VEP. He had the experience in running and organizing and motivating field workers. He understood the needs of a well-run home office to administer programs, and he could bring star power to VEP events and initiatives. This photo is actually from the very first year he was director. He and Julian Bond went on a voting rights tour of the South. During the day, they would go to people's homes and talk to them, just like here out on the porch. And at night, they would have mass meetings at churches and schools and the Rotary Club, wherever they could get a chance to speak, to bring people in and just talk about the importance of voting and the importance of even being registered and the power of that. So most importantly, Lewis brought a faith in the power of nonviolent direct action and the legacy of the beloved community. He would specifically cite the beloved community in his directives as executive director. And in his very first annual report for VEP, he wrote that he wanted to expand all programs to the Mexican American, the low-income white, and the Spanish-speaking migrant communities, and Americans between the ages of 18 and 21 who had recently gotten the vote in '71. I'll just go forward. So one of the other things that they continued to do, VEP, was to report back on why people weren't registering to vote. And this is actually from a field report. I don't know how well you can read it, but it says, what problems do registered blacks face in voting? Losing their jobs, lives being threatened, fear of being put outdoors, bribery by campaign workers in the form of giving half pints of liquor or money if they agree to vote for a certain candidate. And this is something you see over and over again in the documentation in the VEP records, is this actual reporting from a small county or a town somewhere in the South and people saying what they were up against. These reports get kind of scary when you see the dates on them are like 1979. And there's this kind of, I remember one of the reports I saw that was a complaint that even though they were allowed to vote in town, the doctor's offices, the waiting rooms were still all segregated. And I told my mom about it because it was from 1977, and I was like, I can't believe, in 1977, just a few years before I was born, people still had to sit in segregated waiting rooms. And she was like, my high school was still segregated in '77. What do you think was going on? And in small towns all over the South, people were still getting away with this kind of behavior. And the great thing about VP is that it's really heavily documented. So some of their specific initiatives were to translate voter registration cards and rules into Spanish for publication in Spanish language newspapers throughout the South, specifically Florida and Texas, but a few other places as well. Create Spanish and English versions of all their publications and advertising, and really do some specific youth-oriented programming. They had these youth jamborees, and they made these great posters in Spanish and English that kind of showed King and John Lewis and were, you're the next generation, carry it on, those kind of ads. Oh, this is another terrible piece from the collection. This is also from the 70s. This is not 1965. And this is the kind of thing that these groups were sending back to BEP to be filed away, and this is the exact kind of documentation we have. This slide may be really hard to see, but this is from the Chicano Roundtable Voter Registration and Education Project. And the county on it is Behar, Texas. That's San Antonio. So it's a large metropolitan area. And under remarks, what this field worker has written is the county official in charge of processing the voter registration cards submitted by us has many ways to delay the actual registration receipts being sent out. One is by refusing to deputize those of us working on the projects, and this is from '72. So this is just, again, some more of that documentary evidence of what VEP workers were running into. So between '62 and '73, VEP registered 1.5 million voters in the South. When it was founded, there were only 50 African-American elected officials in southern states, and by 1973, there were over 1,300. Despite these successes, the national recession of '74 hit VEP hard. Foundation support for the organization dried up, and Lewis responded by cutting office staff, replacing field staff with volunteer advisory boards, and cutting grants to communities. Despite this, over the next 10 years, VEP managed to keep their doors open, but they ran through 4 or 5 different executive directors very quickly. The office staff went from 25 to 9 to 4. The same kind of thing that happens with any organization that just doesn't have money anymore. And so what you see VEP doing, rather than giving all these grants, is starting very, very targeted campaigns and starting opening up partnerships with other organizations. So this one on the left is one of their bigger youth campaigns. This is a symbol of defeat to encourage people to vote. The one on the right is from one of their women's campaigns. This is actually the mock-up of the poster itself with the little cutout pieces. But in the 80s, they had their first female executive director, and she really turned the organization to looking at women registered to vote and how they were still very underrepresented in the South. And one of the things I love about this is that she very consciously wanted to tie the concept of voting to being very chic and sophisticated. So 20 years ago, a lot of their voting was, like those voting rights tours John Lewis was on, a lot of their representation of the power of the vote was, folks out on the porch in their overalls, and here it's this very like chic model-looking woman, and tying casting that ballot to being a certain aspirational level. This is one of their national campaigns. And then this is just a local one. Project 23 was specifically Georgia focused, where Maynard Jackson and Julian Bond literally drove around, I think, in a Cadillac convertible to 23 little counties, encouraging people to get involved and vote. They also expanded VEP also expanded its kind of idea of minority later in the 80s. One of the partnerships that they partnered with a lot of national women's organizations to create these education campaigns, but they also partnered with the National Coalition for Disabled Persons. Through that partnership, VEP also documented that a lot of states that had federal mandates to provide absentee voting or rides to the polls for people with physical handicaps were not doing it, that those programs just didn't exist. So it was just another way to disenfranchise people. So VEP worked with organizations for the elderly as well as the physically handicapped to create awareness of voting, the importance of voting, and to provide these services and make the federal government aware that the services didn't exist. They also partnered with a lot of environmental organizations. At that point in the 80s, being an environmentalist candidate was a minority position. And so BEP partnered with specifically statewide environmental organizations to educate people running on environmental platforms. So that's just another place where BEP was kind of on the cutting edge of defining who was disenfranchised. So due to its own financial, flip to the back. In '87, VEP moved to the campus of Atlanta University to try and save money on rent and utilities. But by '92, it was almost completely defunct. It had one employee left, who was the executive director, Ed Brown, and he had worked for almost a year with no pay, and his last job was to pack up the office and just send it over to the archives at AUC. And thankfully he did, and it was there for 25 years before I came to it. I think despite this then, VEP should be considered a success. Their programs registered millions of voters and educated people on how the political process works. Their campaigns created awareness, and their workshops and seminars provided practical training for elected officials who would not have found it anywhere else. VEP's research arm also collected and published voter and election statistics that were used to understand voting patterns, track successes and failures, find segments of the population that continue to be disenfranchised, and act as watchdogs for those doing the disenfranchising. VEP was an active expression of the beloved community and the promises of the civil rights movement. They moved ahead to address issues that lingered in post-segregation communities, to encourage grassroots activism and local empowerment, and most importantly, to expand the message of the movement to include many communities. And this is my favorite campaign that they funded. Don't act like a goat, register so you can vote. And that's the end of my presentation, but I do want to point out that if you're interested in doing research on VEP, which a few people are finally starting to come to now through the fact that the collection's open and the finding aid's online, you can always contact the archives at Atlanta University Center. Thank you.
Hey y'all, can everybody hear me okay? So I'm gonna have to start my presentation by asking for your forgiveness. I was in Denver all week packing a really exciting collection that I'll be pleased to talk to you about in like a week when it's actually in town and open. But I've come back with some terrible airplane crud, and so I'm sure I sound all plugged up and ridiculous, but I'm still very excited to be here talking to you about something that is near and dear to my heart, which is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference records here at Marble. And much like Courtney, as I was processing this collection between 2009 and 2012, came to understand a completely untold history of this organization that, in my opinion, could drastically reshape how we understand the continuing civil rights movement. And so I am very excited to be able to continue to talk about this collection and hopefully encourage new scholars to come and explore the 1,000 or so boxes of records that we have at Marble. So I'm not here today as a scholar. My job this afternoon isn't actually to make any earth-shattering revelations or pronouncements about SCLC. I'm gonna leave that to you guys. My job today is to hopefully tell you a story about SCLC that you don't know, and to get you excited about archives. Archives in general, of course, because all archives are exciting, but more specifically about archives in Marble and how they can illuminate the intersections between communities and movements. It's also been about 4 days since I've looked at this, so let me pay a little attention to my PowerPoint. The SCLC records at Emory are a great example of those intersections, in my opinion, because the records show how communities collided in the post-civil rights era as needs and tactics changed and the scope of ongoing civil rights work expanded. Most folks know in 1957, in the wake of the Montgomery bus boycott, a group of Southern clergy and civil rights leaders gathered in Atlanta to found SCLC. The group's original stated mission was to desegregate transportation systems throughout the South, but leaders quickly realized that scope wasn't broad enough. There was actually far more work to be done to secure equality and dismantle Jim Crow, and so under the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr., SCLC positioned itself to take on that work. Throughout the 1960s, SCLC was instrumental in the passage of the Voting and Civil Rights Acts, as well as a leader in numerous iconic campaigns of the decade, including the March on Washington, the Albany and St. Augustine campaigns, the Selma campaign, and the Poor People's Campaign in 1968. But I'm not here to tell you that story. Everybody knows that story. While the Southern Christian Leadership Conference may not carry a lot of name recognition in certain circles, folks at least know Dr. King's name and have some understanding of who he was and what his leadership meant to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. To some extent, people even know a little about the last 2 years of the 60s. Even if they don't realize the connection to SCLC, they've heard of the Poor People's Campaign and the Charleston Hospital Workers' Strike in 1969. And lucky for me today, the SCLC records at Emory don't really tell that story either. What I want to talk about today is what happened to SCLC in the wake of the 1960s. I've been working with this collection in various capacities for 5 years now and have done my level best to spread the gospel of marble, as we like to say, and the wonderful materials we have, and I still meet people who have no idea what became of King's organization following his assassination. Scholars and students alike are surprised to find out exactly how active and relevant SCLC was in the 1970s, and this is just some material from the collection that we do have of the 1960s, because I'm also an archivist, and so I want to show you the stuff, because the stuff is the good part. We have a complete run of Soul Force. We have the original draft of Ralph Abernathy's letter from a Charleston jail during the Charleston Hospital Workers Strike, as well as some material relating to the Citizenship Education Program, which you can see in the middle, a photo of Dorothy Cotton leading a workshop. So folks are surprised to find out that SCLC carried on after 1968. And indeed was incredibly relevant in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And in fact, an early voice in debates and controversies that our communities have yet to resolve. And here you can see a few flyers that I'll get back to in a little bit, as well as a photo of a demonstration during the Winn-Dixie boycott to remove South African products from the grocery store shelves. So I myself learned all of this very gradually as I processed the collection over 3 years. And primarily, I think the reason that folks are unfamiliar with this story is that the records weren't available before 2012. They were stored in various closets and storage lockers at SCLC and nowhere near accessible to the scholarly community until SCLC gave them to Emory in 2007. After which it still took us 5 years to secure funding and actually organize the material so that it was usable. By comparison, the records of the King years have been available for some time between the portion of the material housed at the King Center and a second portion recently made available at Atlanta University Center. The difference between the material at Marble and the other two collections is really one of time period. The bulk of Emory's collection postdates 1968 and focuses on the more recent history of SCLC. Our collection is distinct in that it shows how an iconic civil rights organization revitalizes and regalvanizes itself to address new and changing community needs, as well as how it reorients itself to topple systemic forces of inequality that are less visible than white-only signs and fire hoses. The records primarily document the presidencies of Ralph Abernathy and Joseph E. Lowry, and contain both administrative files, sound and video recordings, which are amazing. It's really one of the best parts of the collection is the AV, photographs and printed material. And this is just a little bit of before and after, just so y'all know. On the left is a box of extremely moldy correspondence. At the top, a box that literally was labeled from desktop, and you can sort of see even the ink refill in the top corner, and then the beautiful newly labeled acid-free boxes, which is what you will encounter when you come to Marble to look at this collection. So what happened to SCLC after 1968? Its core mission never changed: to redeem the soul of America, to use nonviolent direct action to combat social ills, to work peacefully within or outside of accepted legal and social systems to protect and secure the civil rights of all people. At the heart of the mission are sort of two fundamental notions. One, that a basic quality of life is a civil right. Over time, this included not only economic security, but also physical safety, healthy bodies, and healthy, vibrant communities. And secondly, that SCLC is a highly qualified leader in these realms, both because of its history and experience with nonviolent direct action, and because of its connection to the church. And that connection to the church is very important to a number of the programs that I'm going to tell you about in just a second. What changed quickly after 1968 actually was the scope of activity in service to that mission. I could stand here all day and give you examples of how SCLC's work changed, from an environmental justice campaign against polychlorinated biphenyl dumping in North Carolina and major economic agreements with national corporations to numerous anti-death penalty campaigns and a 1986 teen rap competition promoting positive messages in the budding music genre. And I'll answer all the questions you have about that later, but what I want to talk about are 4 specific programs that I think best highlight the connections and intersections that we're thinking about while we're here at the conference. Firstly, the Stop the Killing and the Violence program, which was a major initiative for SCLC in the 1990s, focused primarily on curbing gun violence in African American communities. A significant component of Stop the Killing was frequent gun buyback events during which SCLC, in cooperation with local law enforcement, would collect firearms in exchange for things like supermarket gift certificates and cash. No questions were asked during these exchanges. And photographs in the collection show numerous young people volunteering at these events, which were held throughout the country, as well as uniformed police officers and local politicians. And I'd also just like to mention that a similar event was held following the Sandy Hook Elementary School shootings a year or so ago, which is sort of one example of how SCLC was on the forefront of addressing a lot of these issues in these very specific ways. A driving force behind the program was the belief that personal safety and freedom from violence are fundamental human rights. In fact, that same belief drove a lot of SCLC's programming in the 80s and 90s, including its anti-death penalty work. The collection at Emory includes a tremendous amount of material documenting these efforts, and I think it shows the strength of SCLC's connection to its past, even as it evolved to combat modern problems. And these are just 2 flyers from a couple of different gun buyback events. Sorry. Oh, at the computer, sorry. The second program that I want to mention is the Crisis in Healthcare for Black and Poor Americans hearings. In 1984, in response to Reagan-era budget cuts that targeted services in poor and minority communities, SCLC spearheaded a series of hearings across the United States called the Crisis in Healthcare for Black and Poor Americans. SCLC held hearings in 11 cities, including Chicago, Kansas City, Detroit, Charlotte, and Los Angeles. At the hearings, citizens, medical professionals, activists, and lawmakers testified to the difficulties in obtaining health care in these areas. Incredible statistics were cited during the hearings that brought the disparities of care into sharp relief. For example, a hearing in Detroit revealed that a neighborhood near a large medical hospital had an infant mortality rate nearly 4 times the national average, and that Detroit itself had the highest Black infant mortality rate in the nation. Other cities revealed similar harsh realities, from decreased numbers of hospitals and increased patient loads for doctors to complications stemming from fear of generic medication and an inability to afford name brand. In a statement announcing the hearings, then SCLC President Joseph Lowery said, quote, "We are serving notice on this administration and whichever one may be sitting there on Pennsylvania Avenue this time next year that failure to address the crisis in healthcare for poor Americans will be met with massive resistance." Following the hearings, SCLC compiled a lengthy report of its findings and submitted copies to both political parties and numerous organizations within the federal government. And though at the time nothing came of the report, its impact feels very relevant to me today as America struggles to repair its broken healthcare system. The records at Emory actually contain audio tape of all 11 hearings as well as that report and numerous planning documents from the overall program. The next initiative is the Wings of Hope anti-drug program, which was actually a precursor to the Stop the Killing initiative and was founded in 1989. It was established to address the drug epidemic affecting cities throughout the United States, but was particularly targeted at Metro Atlanta. Under the leadership of Joseph Lowery and program coordinator Reverend Richard Dalton, the Wings of Hope program organized church and community-based initiatives such as workshops on drug prevention strategies, AIDS education, youth empowerment, mentorship, and also offered support to at-risk families. Of particular importance to Wings of Hope was coalition building among churches, communities, government service providers in the United States Department of Justice, who actually provided quite a bit of funding for the program. Such partnerships were established with the intent of reducing crime and the demand for illicit drugs in and around Atlanta. And finally, one of my favorite programs, the National AIDS Program, which was actually an initiative of SCLC's sister organization, SCLC Women. And I have to be very clear that the SCLC Women records are not part of the SCLC collection at Emory. And so the number of documents in the SCLC records are fairly few and focus primarily on the partnership between the two organizations. But it really was an astonishing program, and so I like to mention it anyway. SCLC Women began the National AIDS Program in 1985 at a time when the disease was still incredibly taboo, but no less devastating to communities. It was funded by grants from the CDC, which enabled the program to establish field offices in 6 cities, including Atlanta and Kansas City. From these field offices, they promoted local HIV/AIDS education and awareness campaigns, providing both workshops and printed educational materials to communities. They were especially concerned to promote the church's responsibility in the fight against HIV and AIDS, and often held workshops in neighborhood churches. In 1987, SCLC and SCLC Women partnered to host the Ministers' Conference on AIDS in the Black community, which the documents on the PowerPoint are from. It's actually the draft and final typed copy of a letter that Joseph Lowry sent to registered ministers who were coming to the conference, encouraging them to bring at least one lay person from their congregation so that they could spread the information and the message to as many as possible. And so all of this is not necessarily to indemnify SCLC from criticism. I think they were really ahead of the game in a lot of ways, but have also always had a very troubled relationship both with the LGBTQ community and women, actually. Long criticized by feminists, especially, SCLC has continued to struggle to find a place for women in its ranks. In fact, a separate organization was founded to specifically address women's and family issues, in effect creating a sort of gender segregation between the two groups. And again, many of the programs specifically targeted to communities suffering from HIV and AIDS or to women ran up against some traditional family values that many could argue are problematic and are in fact based on assumptions about what men and women are and do. However, the strength of the collection at Marble is how evident these tensions are. And I think the collection really shows how SCLC fought to secure civil rights for everyone, but also points to the assumptions and blind spots that the organization often took for granted in its work.
Thanks, sir. I don't need that. I was in Victoria, British Columbia earlier this week at a transgender conference, and I didn't have time to put slides together because we just landed a little bit ago. Good afternoon. I want to begin by putting our moderator on the spot. I want to thank Charles for all the hard work over the course of the past year to put this conference together. So thank you very much. And then I also want to say that we are very lucky to have 2 local legends here in the audience. Winston, thank you for coming. Dave, thank you for coming. I appreciate y'all being here. So one of the things I'm going to do, I'm the curator of modern political and historical collections at Marble, and I'm going to take a little broader perspective from you about our collection. Instead of focusing on individual collections, focus more on building 2 separate areas. I want to talk to you very briefly about Marble and what our mission is, and then how these collecting areas fit into that. And then I want to give you just one example of a case study where these things intersect, where these 2 lines come together. Because, the Oxford English Dictionary defines intersection as the point where two lines converge. And so those are our two lines, and they're going to converge. Marble's mission is to acquire, preserve, arrange, describe, and provide public access to materials of lasting historical value. And our name reflects the types of materials that we collect. Manuscripts, y'all know what manuscripts are? You can't answer. Y'all know what manuscripts are? Personal papers, right? Archives are?
Organization.
You can't, you're a ringer, you can't answer it. Records of businesses and organizations. What about rare books? Y'all know what rare books are?
Books that are hard to find.
Books that are rare, excellent, excellent. All those things. So those are the types of materials that we collect. But we collect them in three main areas. The most important one is Southern history, culture, and politics. That's most important because it's my area. The next one is African American history and culture, and also in English language, poetry, and literature. Now, one of the things you say is, what ties all three of those things together? We've actually spent a lot of time thinking about that as we spent the past year trying to develop our collections policy. But the best thing that we can come up with, and this was Rosemary McGee, the director of Marble, said that Marble features collections of communities and people who were once on the margins and are now part of the mainstream. That fits for our Irish literary collections. That fits for our Southern collections, which the South for so long was considered the benighted South, so far out of step with the rest of the nation, and obviously it fits with our African American collections. So what we'd like to think of as this movement from the margins to the mainstream is also what happened in the archives and in the historical professions. These communities, these areas, these places moved from the margins into the mainstream, both in history and in the archive. And so what Marble does is collect materials of people who were in these margins, moved into the mainstream, both socially, culturally, and politically. When you think about those areas in this movement from the margins to the mainstream, one thing that looking at our collections over the years has really brought to me is that ties them together is this concept of activism. We have amazing collections of activists. In my area, it goes all the way back to 1875, when the Mystic Knights of the Ku Klux Klan wrote a broadside that they posted on the well outside of Augusta, Georgia, to the friends and members of Glen Mary Church. And it says, and I want to read this, the broadside starts, quote, "We the Klan understand you are guarding the road and feel it our duty to break it up. Now our advice to you is to stop the night meetings." The importance of this broadside isn't in the Klan's words or the Klan's warnings, but in the hints of this community that was organized, that was active, that was guarding the road, was having night meetings after work, and then protecting their community. And so that's what I see is the origins of this activism collections. But then it moves on, and we have collections about the temperance movement. We have collections about women's suffrage. We have the report of the first women's suffrage movement march in Atlanta in 1917. It's like, I can't imagine what it was like for women to march in downtown Atlanta to vote in 1917. It's an extraordinary event. It's on a sheet of paper. And that kind of moves us forward to the civil rights movement. I mean, now y'all know, in 1996, there were two significant events in Atlanta that shifted, kind of had a seismic influence on what happened in Atlanta. One, of course, was the 1996 Summer Olympics, right? A southern city hosted the Olympics. The second one was that Randall Burkett was hired as the first collector of African American collections at Marble. And he literally transformed our collections. And one of the focus that he went with was for activists in the civil rights movement. So we have the collections of the papers of Doris Derby, of Louise Thompson Patterson, John Oliver Killens, Constance Curry, and the records of SCLC. just to name a few, and like if y'all know any of those folks, like they're not the same person in the same area. It's an incredible both depth and breadth to these materials. The items in the collection run from everything from a broadside for a March 1946 rally for Negro police officers here in Atlanta, to a paper towel that Jim Foreman, who was the head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, wrote a message to Joan Browning when she was in the Dougherty County Jail down in Albany. Now, we all know, civil rights scholars, we all knew that folks passed messages in jail, right? The lawyers would put them in the newspapers or magazines, they passed them around. But I'd never seen one before, because when you're in jail in Dougherty County in the 1960s, would you think about preserving a paper towel that someone wrote a note to you on that said, "Hang on, Joan, I hear you're on a hunger strike. You're now a SNCC volunteer worker." She actually kept this and other notes that were written on napkins, toilet paper, and all that. It's incredible. We knew they did that, but I'd never actually seen one before. So the materials run from that to this 1946 broadside, which I personally think is the most amazing civil rights document we have, because it shows how World War II changed the language of how people spoke about and thought about their rights. The last paragraph on this broadside reads, and I'm going to quote here so that I don't get it wrong. It reads, "The average Negro veteran has given 3 years of his life to fight Hitler and returns to find Hitlerism, racial bigotry, and white supremacy facing him at home. We demand Negro policemen." Before World War II, you never would have seen the word demand in the North or the South. So, one of the things is we'll never know when the civil rights movement began. There's a long line of resistance to the imposition of Jim Crow from the day after the Civil War ended. But that shows how language and how all of this changed. And it's a really remarkable document. One new opportunity that I want to mention before I move on is that we also have the bureau files for the Atlanta Newsweek Bureau. And the Atlanta Bureau was the one that was sent out all across the South to cover the civil rights movement. They would get a telegram from the New York office. It would say, "Need 20,000 words about the Atlanta Wall," or about St. Augustine or Albany. The reporters would go out. They were great reporters and they were beautiful writers. And they'd write 20,000 amazing, heartbreaking words. They'd send those 20,000 words to the editors in New York. The editors in New York would pick 90 of them out, combine them with other reports from around the country, and then print them in the paper. So this is an incredible trove of scholarship about the South and about the civil rights movement that has never been published and never been seen before. I can't tell you how extraordinary this stuff is. Plus, based on the fact that I hate reading it because people like Marshall Frady work for him, and Marshall Frady is an amazing writer, and every time I read this stuff, I always think I'll never be able to write like this. So I try and stay out of the collection because it's a frustrating experience. So those are that's one line on our intersection. The other one I want to mention is our LGBT collections. In 2005, we received our first openly LGBT manuscript and archive collections. One was the Records of Network Q, which was the first regular program about the LGBT community to be featured on public TV. And the other was the Records of the Southeast Arts, Media, and Education Project, which was organized here in Atlanta and published the Southern Voice or Georgia Voice. I always forget which one was first.
Southern Voice.
Oh, thank you. I knew that. The Southern Voice and other materials. So that kind of laid the foundation to what we're building now, which is a nationally recognized collection of materials that document LGBT communities in Atlanta, Georgia, and the South. And the question is, well, why Atlanta, Georgia, and the South? The first off is that's where our other collections are concentrated, right? I have to say this up front. I don't view this as building our LGBT community, or our LGBT collections. This is about building our collections about Atlanta, Georgia, and the South. I just sometimes have to frame it in that way for what I'm doing, but I do not see this separate from the other collections that we bring in. But the main reason why I wanted to focus on the South is because of this incredible essay that I read in the program that we have for the 3rd Annual Southeastern Conference of Lesbians and Gay Men, which was held in Atlanta in 1978. Dave was there. And in the introduction, which was called Welcome Y'all, which I thought was very appropriate, they argue that, quote, the South's long history of racism, sexism, and anti-gay bigotry caused our struggles as lesbians and gay men to be qualitatively different than that of our gay sisters and brothers in other parts of the United States. Let me repeat that. The South's long history of racism, sexism, and anti-gay bigotry caused our struggles as lesbians and gay men to be qualitatively different than that of our gay sisters and brothers in other parts of the United States. That's a very powerful and interesting argument, and something that I wanted to capture, and I think that fits so well with, I'm gonna get cut off. It fits so well with this intersection of civil rights and with the LGBT collections. That absolutely fascinated me, and that's one of the reasons why I was specifically concentrating on Atlanta now. Y'all know how many people were in Atlanta in 1900? 89,000. You know how many we had in 2010? 6 million. That's a remarkable change in a short period of time. But the LGBT community is an important part of that transformation. And that's why I wanted to be, we have great collections that document what I call the making of modern Atlanta, which is like Atlanta in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And that's exactly the time when the LGBT community here came to prominence. And they're a very important part of this transformation. All right. Fixing to do some cutting. All right, I said I'd do a case study. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about is these new opportunities for scholarship. And one of the collections I thought about is one that Charles has seen, which is we have the records of the National Association of Black and White Men Together. And those are the records, both the national records, and it has the local chapter records. And in terms of scholarship, that dynamic is fascinating. I've spent a lot of time, obviously, in the Atlanta files, but I've also spent a good bit of time in the Memphis files. And it's amazing with this collection because you can look at the national stuff and then you can compare. They had chapters all over, even internationally, but Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, Dallas, Kansas City, Los Angeles, Memphis, New York, Philadelphia, San Diego, San Francisco, Washington, D.C. It's remarkable because they have newsletters, they have publications, they have periodicals, all from the same time period. So you can track these issues both locally, but you can also track them nationally. And one of the things that I want to work on is looking where AIDS serve, like they all have safe sex stuff in it. And on the back of every one of the safe stuff is local resources for HIV testing. And what I want to do is map this. I want to map a geography of AIDS service organizations in 1988, in 1985. That's not the kind of, where in the city are these places? What's the relationship to other organizations? A lot of these places had lesbian and gay centers, and it's like, what's the geographic reference between those? Just to wrap up, I'm skipping and skipping and skipping. One of the things in there is also, there's a lot of personal accounts of people, anonymous, but people who were members who found out that they were HIV positive. And one of the remarkable ones that I found in the Memphis was about the movie Philadelphia. Y'all remember the movie Philadelphia? In this amazing front, it's probably 600, 700 word article. In the conclusion, he wrote, quote, "As I viewed the movie, I reflected upon my life as an African-American gay man affected by HIV illness. Has to be filtered and fit to the sensibilities of mainstream America. I cannot be black. I can be gay, but I have to be conservative and played by a heterosexual actor. I can have a lover, but I cannot be too demonstrative. I can have AIDS, but God forbid if I love freely. So where am I?" So the newsletters are these remarkable things about safe sex, about activities, but then personal reflections, personal stories. And it's just the kind of stuff that you have a hard time finding other places, and that you can't that you have a hard time comparing with other places in the time period. So that's kind of one of the opportunities, and one of many intersections that there are in these collections. And I'd love to hear from y'all about what you're working on and what kind of intersections you find in your work. Thanks.
Amazing. Let's have another round of applause for our panelists.
I don't want that.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.